Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by David Burkus, author of Friend of a Friend. David, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Are you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
Yeah, so I guess my biggest piece of advice would actually be the question, which is whether or not you've written a proposal. Whatever route you're going to go, self-published, traditionally published, hybrid published, do it all yourself and photocopy it and throw it from the rafters of a football stadium, whatever you're going to do. It helps tremendously to write out that proposal in that sort of traditional New York publishing house style. The reason is that you get really clear on what's the distillation of the message that I'm actually trying to say. I don't think you should write to find out. I think you should write once you have the plan, but also who the exact audience is, so that as I'm writing, I can be testing out those ideas, et cetera. And then what the marketing plan is. Those are sort of the three elements of the book proposal. And if you don't have that nailed out before you start writing the book, it's not going to come to you during the drudgery of typing it all out. So if you have it planned out to begin with, then you can write the book that is suited to that plan and then go execute on the plan. If you just try and figure it out as you go along, you're going to waste a lot of energy. So that's probably my biggest piece of advice, is start with that plan. I don't believe in writer's block. I believe in you didn't do enough research or you didn't have enough of a plan.
Well, and it's just like outlining. You want to format your plan. You want to figure out the topics you want to talk about, but you also want to figure out, who are you talking to? Are you talking to corporate business? Are you talking to small business? Are you talking to people that want to write a book or publish a book? And you got to really get clear on where you want to go, and then you can tailor that towards that particular person.
Yeah, totally. And I think the other thing is we don't do enough thinking through of psychographics as opposed to demographics, right? So we might think, oh, I'm reaching out to entrepreneurs. Like, but who? Because some entrepreneurs are struggling to get just their business off the ground, and others are trying to deal with, oh, I've got a successful idea, but I have to scale. Those two different entrepreneurs are not looking for the same book, right? So I think that, that psychographics piece of specifically what stage are they in whatever community they're a part of, and then how do I help that person? For my first book, I just kind of wrote whatever. And actually my first two, and my third book, I literally had a person in mind, a person. I can't name them because then they'll know who they are and that'll ruin the whole thing. But sort of the book's about networking and how do you do it without feeling sleazy and inauthentic and what have you. And I had a specific former student of mine who really struggled with that, not just because he was introverted, but also just because this was a foreign territory for him, and he was in my mind writing the whole thing. And when you write it like you're talking to that one person facing that one problem, you write a better book. And then that one person is usually not the only person in the world facing that scenario. So all of the other people that are in that psychographic also resonate with the book way more than if you just did what I want to say. Does that make sense?
It does, because one thing that you mentioned was when you're talking about targeting businesses, and I thought immediately either start up or scale up, because that's essentially your audience. And you mentioned it right after that. That was this perfect synergy where you have to know where they are in their journey too. Because with my publishing company, we work with a lot of business owners, and they're either in one of three areas. They're going to be either in startup, scale up, or from that point, they just want to take everything to a whole next level. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, totally. And again, especially if you're doing the sort of my book is a business card thing, well, it's only going to be a good business card if it speaks to that exact thing. It's not if it's just look at me, I'm an amazing business person. I mean, nobody wants to read that.
Yeah, they want to know about the journey, but most importantly, they want to know about the struggle. It's one of the big things I always tell my clients is like, don't be afraid to be vulnerable in your books. Talk about the struggles. Talk about how you went from startup to scale up and the things that you have done to get to that level, and share that information freely. Because my philosophy is we give away information for free. What we charge for on the back end is the implementation side.
Yeah, totally. Or even just like there's a weirdness to the idea that people still want to hear that same message, but in person, right? Like the majority of the revenue that I make in a given year is from giving speeches. everything I say, almost everything I say in the speech was in the book. Like you could have spent $17.70 and just bought the book. I mean, please don't. I would love to come talk to your organization, et cetera. But like, there's still that idea. Maybe it's because of the 5 minutes of customizing it to your solution, or maybe it's just that there's something about, that being in person. So you can give away all of the information for free, 100% of it. And then there's still people that are like, yeah, but I want you to come do it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
So in the traditional publishing world, we'd call this platform, but I like to think of it as sort of that community, right? How do you build a community of people before, definitely during, before and during you're writing the book? Otherwise, I mean, getting published, getting a thing printed, like I said, like you can do it with a Xerox machine and a saddle staple. But if you're looking for a traditional publisher, that platform is going to be a huge part. But even if you're self or hybrid publishing, you want to know who that community is, and you want them to be your sort of ambassadors. So I usually think of this as the hardest part of getting published, because my experience has been with traditional publishers that won't even bet on you unless you have that platform. But I think a lot of people skip that step. I think a lot of people think, okay, here's what I want to write a book about. Great. Like we were talking about before, go put a lot of those ideas out into the world for free and then build a community or a platform around it. That way, you've got traction once you publish the thing. You can sell 500 copies of a book to your existing friends and contacts and what have you. But if you want to sell any more than that, those people need to feel like they're part of your community and go advocate for you. And I don't know that anybody can get profitable on just selling 500 books. So we know you need those people from the business standpoint. But the bigger thing is most people want to write a book to have impact. Well, the impact doesn't come from speaking one-to-one, and it doesn't come from one-to-many. It comes from when the many start speaking to the other many, and you need to build that community ahead of time in order to get there.
And what are some of the pieces of advice that you would give our listeners to help them build that platform, to build that that area, so to speak, that tribe?
Yeah, so I was my story is I wrote my first book after what I would call my whole platform was just that I was writing for different publications. I had a podcast that had some listeners, not that many, but I was writing for Harvard Business Review and for Forbes and for a couple other places that could then publicize the message out. And it didn't work as well as building that. And so I'm a big fan of the work of Tim Grahl and his work on author marketing. And he has this sort of system that he calls the connection system, where I don't care what it is. Like, Paul, for you, it's a podcast predominantly, but what is that piece of content that is the seeding of your idea that you can put out on a regular basis? That content also then needs to be shareable. And then at the end, there needs to be a way to capture who enjoyed that content so they can sign up to see the next piece of content. Now, what I just described can work on a lot of different platforms. That can be email newsletter subscribers, which would be my recommendation, but it can be followers on YouTube. It can be, likes on Facebook. It can be whatever it is. But there needs to be that consistent piece of content that you're putting out there that people are reading, enjoying, but also sharing. And then because they're sharing it, that captures new people. The single person that I think does this way better than anyone, myself included, and it's jealousy inducing, is a friend of mine named James Clear. He just wrote a book called Atomic Habits. It came out in October. It's been on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list for like literally, it's been on for every single week except the week that Howard Schultz bought his way on the list, and that bumped James off. And then the following week, Schultz dropped off and James was on. By the way, I don't know for sure that Schultz did it. I just suspect it because when famous people show up for 1 week and then drop off, we suspect that that's what happened.
Funny how that works.
I know. Right? So I'm not making a definitive claim. I'm just saying that's my read on the situation of what happened. But what that is a testament to the fact that James has been writing 1 article or 1 to 2 articles every single week for the last 6 years. He built an email list of 500,000 people, most of whom read his content every week, a smaller percentage of which share it every week. That drives new eyeballs to his article, which then sign up for the email list, and the system perpetuates. And the biggest thing, and where this connection system really gets muster, is he didn't try and be all things. He wasn't running a YouTube show and amazing Instagram stories and a Snapchat and whatever. He was like 1 article published on my site, sent out with copious links to where people can share it. And at the bottom, they can sign up for the newsletter so that next week I'll just email them the article and the cycle begins again. And it takes a long time to get to critical mass, but when you get to critical mass, it starts going gangbusters, and James's life is proof of that.
And that also reflects the biggest lesson that I've ever learned in business, and that is there is no such thing as an overnight success. Everything takes time, it takes consistency, and we're talking about James Clear. You brought up the perfect example of someone who has utilized his resources, has posted consistently, has messaged his tribe consistently, and has built up that following to 500,000 people over a certain amount of years. That's what it takes to be successful, is being consistent and doing it every week, and to make sure to have those calls to actions, to share the link, to subscribe to the newsletter. That's exactly business 101.
Yeah, no, totally. And you know, I bring up James not only because he's a great guy and he deserves it, but also like I'm mad that James and I have been in the game for about the same amount of time, right? And whereas I was looking for ever bigger publications to write for and other ways, I mean, I've given a TED Talk that has 2 million views and all of this stuff, and James just was like, no, it's about the article and email, the article and the email, the article and the email. And then suddenly he bubbles up over the surface and just explodes. To your point, if you weren't part of the 500,000 people that knew who he was, you're like, who is this person? But in reality, a smaller band, 500,000 people, have been following his work for 8 years. And that builds a tribe and a kind of loyalty that you just can't replace with any other tactic.
When you mentioned he's doing this weekly, so that's 52 weeks a year, or 52, 53, and you times that by 8, I mean, that's 420, 430 right there. That's 430 different opportunities to reach your audience. So everything just builds. It's almost like compound interest. It just builds over time, year after year, and just having it being consistent.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And so when as his book was coming out and I was chatting with him, et cetera, I kind of had that realization. More recently in my own career, I've basically done the same thing. I've been committed to what we call the Daily Burk, which is a 2 to 3 minute video every single weekday with a different tip, trick, or what have you. And we've been at it about 7 months, which is but when I started it, I was like, I want to talk about what this is doing 4 years from now. I'm not even worried about the first year and what that growth looks like, because that's that case in point. It's like compound interest. You don't invest this week and then even 9 months from now go, how's my investment doing? You just check back years later. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we've been doing, and it's been cool to see the impact that's had on my current book. But I'm also sort of not worried about that. I'm worried about 2 years from now when we launch the next one, what asset have I built in this system because we've been doing the daily show.
Well, let's talk about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that has worked well.
So, I mean, I hinted at it with James, and I was smart enough to do it, but it's without a doubt, it's email. So I assumed that my connections to media publications and podcasters and what have you would be enough when my first book came out. I remember I actually met Tim about 2 months before it came out, and he was like, dude, you're headed for trouble. You need to focus on these things. And I was like, whatever, you're just trying to sell me something, right? I'm sure you run into clients that are the exact same way, right? Mm-hmm. Here's the tactic. Yeah, whatever, you're just trying to upsell me. No, it's actually the best advice. And so since then, we've been focused on that. So even the way that we're sharing on the video on every video friendly platform, but the call to actions always go back to the site. And what happens is that the email list gets sort of the greatest hits of the daily video, so that I know what piece of content is most shareable that I created last week. And then that's what I send out to the email list. And then no surprise, that becomes the most viewed, that becomes the most shared, all of that. Because email, when it comes to selling the book over the launch phase, which is big, but also just long term, at the bottom of almost every email, there's a PS. If you liked this being some point I said in this week's email, you'll also like, and then there's a link to one of the 3 books that I've written, because that's where the insight came from. That's done more to keep giving the book legs, as they say, to keep selling copies over the long term as well. And there's just no replacement for it. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, none of this is new. This is Seth Godin Permission Marketing 2001, right? Because it's the only social network, if I want to use that term, email that is 100% permission based and then 100% direct. You can give me permission by liking me on Facebook, but if Facebook decides they don't care, then I'm out of luck. Same thing with, YouTube, same thing with Twitter, same thing with Instagram, same thing. I've never even figured out how Snapchat works for that reason. Email's still been the furthest. And, you and I are mostly in that business book space. I would argue that email is 10 times more important for that, because an email inbox is today's regular old inbox. It's where people decide what work gets done. So that thing will sit there until someone reads it, takes action on it, does what have you. And so it works the most effectively of any other tactic that I've done. Now, that said, if you want to get really down into the nitty gritty, we've done the standard sort of pre-order campaign where we're creating bonuses that help you do the application piece. Exactly what you said earlier. The book is free, but if you want to apply it, there's this. Mm-hmm. We make bonuses around the application piece, and those are only available to people who do the pre-order. And so the idea is about 4 to 6 weeks before the book launches, we drip those things out, they offer the bonuses and what have you, and then have a system in place where you send in the receipt, you get the bonuses back. And then the other thing that I think worked really well that I tried for this time, this is all sort of standard campaign. I'm saying all this because I'm sure you've had a past guest on that's talked a little bit about all this. What I will say has worked brilliantly that I feel like I can steal credit for on my own is it isn't just here are your bonuses and we're done. I'm usually I have a follow-up sequence now that is 3 or 4 weeks after they bought the book, and again maybe 4 months later, checking in and seeing if they would leave an Amazon review or sending them some share buttons to say, would you share this with a friend or what have you? Because those people that took the action of pre-ordering, those are your number one fans. And so those are the people that are going to be most ready to share. Some of them will do it anyway, but others, if you say, hey, this would only take 5 seconds because I've done all the work for you, a lot of those people will share much more frequently when you do that. So we've had a lot of success with that off a friend of a friend. And it just makes sense because those people were sitting there on the list anyway because I had them registered as pre-orders. Why not follow up with them and ask for reviews for extra sharing, et cetera?
Well, with the pre-order campaign too, the nice thing is you get to see who your true fans are. And they always talk about having those 1,000 Raven fans, and that's always been a philosophy that I've bought into, because I truly believe it. When you have enough people that believe in you, they're going to support every book that you have out there. I mean, I've got 13 out. I'm about to launch my 14th book officially on Amazon. We actually did a couple little previous pre-launches through a couple of different processes, but we're actually making it Amazon official, so to speak, over the next week and a half. And by part of that, we're going to be utilizing parts of a pre-order campaign and just talk about some of the things that, if you're able to leave a review, then we'd like to give you this opportunity, and then this opportunity is available, because that's one of the things where they get the value when they say, okay, wow, if I do help this out, I could look forward to reading this book. But then also there's some nice bonuses involved for kind of like those heads of the fan club, so to speak.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's even great for just sort of planning through certain things. Like I can usually it's between 6 and 8% of the people that are on my email newsletter. It changes because I'm sending them content every single week for 2 years and then launching a book into it. So who they are changes. But about that percentage is I can count on them to pre-order the book, right? Another maybe probably takes it up to 30%. So what is that, like 22? We'll buy it at some point in the first year. Mm-hmm. But you can count on that, right? Okay, I've got to your point about raving fans, I've got this many fans, and these are the percentages of the raving fans, and I can kind of count on that, and it helps tremendously well. And the other thing that I do that just helps from an email, since we're talking tactics, from an email tactic side, is after a launch. So a launch is 6, sometime maybe 8, but 6 weeks or so before the book, a couple emails in the weeks that follow. So let's say maybe 2 months long. After that, I start a purge campaign. I look at, okay, I had 30,000 people on this email list. How many of them never opened a single email in the last 8 weeks? And then I send I start an automation that sends a couple like, hey, are you still interested? Because A, I don't want to pay for you, but like B, you're dragging down all of my open rate metrics and whether or not Google thinks I'm promotional or real or what have you. And so if you're not interested, no worries, I'll leave you alone. Like just you're supposed to click unsubscribe when you're not interested, but I'll do that work for you after that. And so that's worked really well. It's kind of weird. Right now I'm at a point, because we're 9 months post-launch and we're sort of doing that kind of purge campaign. Every week my email list gets smaller
Yeah.
but I'm not worried about it because the open rates and the click-through rates get larger.
Well, it's quality over quantity, and I've deleted probably 5,000 people from my list in the last 2 years because the only people that I want on the list are people that are invested, people that either want to change their life. And it's not necessarily about them even buying anything. It's the fact that they're engaged with our content, and if they're engaged in the fact that we can help them, everything else will take care of itself. So if they're engaged, they stay on the list. But if they're not engaged, if they're not paying attention, then I purge them off the list.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Because A, it's sort of like, why am I paying for this if
Mm-hmm.
if it's not even helping you? But B, like, hey, look, if it's not helping you anymore, great. Like, I don't, and I'm the very similar way. I don't mind if you're that 70% of people that read the content all the time, and then either you bought the book and I have no way of knowing it, or you never got the book. That's fine. Enjoy the content. Have a great life. One day you might tell someone about it, and even though you haven't read it, you might recommend it, and that person will. Or as happens often, I mean, I've booked speeches at organizations and conferences where the person that told them I exist never actually bought the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
They just know what my content is and said, oh, you should check this guy out. He talks about this. So, it all comes back to you when you're putting out all that good content. But to your point, if the people aren't consuming it, then like I've got other people. There's 7.4 billion people in the world.
Yes.
And I'll be happy if 100,000 of them know who I am and enjoy what I do. And my goal is to find that 100,000. And if you're not one of them, cool. But I'm going to be focused on the other ones. Instead of trying to warm you back up to me, I'll go find another one.
Well, and one thing that I've done, and kind of going with your point, and also with James Clear, we had Mike Brodie on the show recently, and he gave me some great advice.
The productivist. I love Mike.
Awesome guy. And we actually had a 30-minute conversation after the podcast was over. And one of the great pieces of advice that he gave me, because I want to think about some additional ways that we can continue to grow our podcast, because it's going very well. We've had all these episodes, but I want to take it next level. And he said, Paul, the best thing you can do is do a weekly email, make it podcast specific. So we actually started this past Monday, where I almost gave him like a highlight reel of the previous week's shows, because we upload 5 episodes a week, Monday through Friday. So we're like, hey, if you got a chance, if you missed the podcast last week, we had these guests on, this is what we talked about, and here's the link to check it out on iTunes. You can also subscribe there if you'd like. And just by doing that, we had a ton of clicks. We had new subscribers added to it. And I'm going, okay, this makes a lot of sense. One, it helps me be more consistent with my content, because typically I'll post, I'll do an email like twice a month. Now it's every week, on top of other emails that we'll be sending out, where it's consistent. We build the tribe, we build the subscribers up to the podcast as well. And that further creates a bond between me and the subscribers, because they're listening to the show. And it was just such a great strategy where it's taken from Mike and also through James Clear, where you're doing that consistent post every week. So 8 years from now, who knows? Maybe I'll have another 500,000 on the list. But it's just a great way to be consistent and to build your brand, so to speak, and take it to that next level.
Yeah, and the other thing it does is then your whatever services you're offering or book you're offering, you then frame it to those people who opted into that thing. So a person who does this really, really well actually is John Acuff, the author of Finish and Do Over and a lot of other really cool books. He's got his broad list, and then he has 4 or 5. He calls it like the speaker list, the writer list, and there's 2 or 3 others that I didn't sign up for, so I don't remember what they're called. But it's not his regular weekly email. It's a different, usually, I mean, it's like a Seth Godin blog length. It's like 200 words, but specific to speaking or specific to writing, or in your case, like specific to podcasting. But then I noticed that when he launched his most recent book, he not only had an email sequence to his whole list, but he had an email sequence specific to, oh, you said you were a writer. Here's how Finish can help you finish your book. Or, oh, you said you're a speaker. Here's how Finish can actually help you get more gigs or whatever, which is kind of brilliant because we talk about open rates and click-through rates and engagement, but we talk about it as sort of this list as a whole. But to our point from right at the beginning about psychographics, he's even sort of breaking up his list by those psychographics. I just thought it was a brilliant way to do it. Sounds like Mike is doing the exact same thing. You're doing the same thing. I haven't started it yet, but you can tell it's on my mind.
Well, and just to take it next level too, so I'm a big fan of Dean Jackson's philosophy too. One with a 9-word email, but the second one is adding that PS at the end. So after every one of these emails, we have PS whenever you're ready. Here are 3 ways that I can help in your author journey. And then there's 3 options. You can either grab a free copy of the second edition of the Get Published book, you can join our Facebook community, or you can even set up a call with my team this week. And then we actually will rotate those out to give different little offers every week that we send this out now going forward. And just by having that and rotating it, it's just a great opportunity where it's not salesy, it's a soft sell. They just know this content at the end. If they want some resources, great. And if they want to talk further to potentially help them with their journey, they have that opportunity. And this email that I send about the show is literally maybe 150 words, if that. So it's short, sweet, it's direct, it's to the point, and it ensures that you also have a high open rate and you have that consistency every single week.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. I love it.
Well, let's take this in a different direction. So we've had a great conversation about marketing, content creation, about the pre-order strategy, but let's talk about the toughest question, and that is, what is your favorite book? And what was the number one thing that you learned from it? Seriously, this is typically the one that stumps our guests the most.
Yeah. So the book that I recommend to people the most often, it's probably the most gifted to, et cetera. And so I guess it would be my favorite, although that's so hard because we'd have to break it up by genre and what have you, is Roger Martin's The Opposable Mind. So Roger Martin was the dean of Rotman School of Management at University of Toronto for a number of years. Just a brilliant, he's an intellectual hero of mine in the business space. And The Opposable Mind is sort of half his idea and then half a profile of leaders who had done this. And it's all about how do you reconcile two mental models that seem opposed, right? So, one of the easiest ones in strategy is everyone says you have to be low cost or you have to be niche or differentiated, but you can't be, if you're low cost, you can't be high touch. Well, what if you were both, right? What would that look like? And so he profiles a lot of different organizations that have done it, but then also sort of lays out this model of how do you take two things that the world has said you have to choose either or and turn them into, you can do both without going crazy. So it's one of those books that you read it the first time and it's not the pleasure of reading it, it's the thinking about it for 6 months afterwards and how it applies to a bunch of different stuff. That's why I've really enjoyed it. So the one thing that I've learned from it is that when people give me either or options, don't assume that there's only those two options. Your whole business is probably an example of this because you're working at the intersection of, do you self-publish or do you traditionally publish? Well, what if there's a way to be a little more hands-on and profitable as this, but also get the quality that you can only really get from commercial offset printing / traditional publishers, right? So that right there is The Opposable Mind in action. So yeah, I love it for that reason and hand out copies of it for that reason and probably drive lots of my friends crazy all for that reason.
Oh, you can't have the best of both worlds, and that's why I'm always a huge believer in hybrid publishing, because it makes sure that your book looks like it's part of the big five publishers, and the fact is it gets marketed correctly. And kind of what you touched on talking about email, we mainly work with book promo companies that send emails to their subscribers because social media is only going to do so much. If you really want to have that conversion rate, we work with the promo companies that send emails to your inbox, because that's kind of what we're talking about email marketing. It works on so many different levels.
Yeah. Oh no. I totally agree. Social media is great for getting the idea behind the book out there in the world, but it's not going to convert it to sales, right? Mm-hmm. And what you say is exactly right about the that sort of best of both worlds. I have lots of friends who are. I'm not the biggest fan of just write the thing in Word and then put it up in Kindle by yourself. Or send it off to iUniverse. Does iUniverse still exist? I don't even know.
I would never even consider them.
Right. The quality is just not there, and people can still tell, right?
Oh yeah.
And that for the longest time that meant you have to do this, but now there's that opposable mind idea. Well, what if you could take this and blend it together in a way that doesn't run out of business? Those things tend to be really, really worthwhile. And I say this not just because Paul's brilliant, everybody go work with Paul, but also because there's proof of concept, because there's a couple other companies that have done it well that prove that, and they all do it a little bit differently. So that proves the integration works differently too. All of that is what Roger talks about in The Opposable Mind. That's why I love it.
And for our final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
So there's a quote in a G.K. Chesterton novel. Chesterton's I'm a huge fan of his, both in fiction and nonfiction, et cetera. And I don't remember what novel it is because I say it so often, but I never remember where it's from. But the quote is that he's saying, the character is saying in frustration, it isn't that they don't see the solution, it's that they don't see the problem. And that, I think, from a business standpoint, my first book was around creativity. This is a huge part of the creative process. Most of us dive into thinking, I've got the problem. I understand the problem, so now I just need the solution. Or we say things like, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. That's ridiculous. The hardest part is figuring out, am I solving the right question? Am I solving the right problem? And so I love that quote because it reminds me to focus on that. What are the problems? What are the questions we need to be asking? That's going to lead me to a much better solution than assuming I know and going from there.
Well, David, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Well, the show notes for the Get Published podcast is probably the best place if you're listening to this. The second best place is davidburkus.com, burkus.com. But that's going to be a link in the show notes. And if you're listening to Paul on the Get Published podcast anyway, you know how to get there, and he wants you to get there. So go there first.
Well, David, thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.